The sky was still dark, silent, almost peaceful, but that morning everything would change, without warning. Without time to react. At the first light of dawn, the sound began, distant, almost imperceptible, until it became impossible to ignore. Engines deep, growing, menacing. And then the first impact. Explosions ripped through the air. The ground trembled. Fire began to spread before anyone could even understand what was happening. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. Screams echoed through the twisted metal. And for a few seconds, no one knew if it was an accident or the beginning of something much worse. That was no ordinary attack. It was the beginning of one of the most devastating moments in modern history. The attack on Pearl Harbor, but here's what few realize. This wasn't just a surprise attack. It was a meticulously calculated plan, executed with almost surgical precision, that completely changed the course of World War II. And the question remains, how was this possible? How was one of the world's greatest powers caught completely off guard? In the middle of a Sunday morning. Now imagine being there. The clock struck just before 8 a.m. Sailors were still waking up. Some laughed, others drank coffee, others wrote letters. Letters that would never be sent. The atmosphere was calm, almost too relaxed. Nobody was prepared. Nobody expected war at that moment. And perhaps that was the biggest mistake, because while everything seemed normal on land, in the sky history was already in motion. I heard a bang, and when I looked up, the sky was full of planes. Accounts like this were repeated among the survivors. The feeling of total surprise, but the truth is different, and it's even more disturbing. The attack didn't come out of nowhere. It was planned for months, every detail, every route, every target, chosen with a single objective: to completely paralyze the United States' ability to react, and it worked. Within minutes, ships began to sink, bases were destroyed. The harbor water mixed with oil and fire, and chaos took over everything. But there's something that makes this story even more tense. There were signs, warnings, clear indications that something was about to happen. Suspicious movements, ignored information, alerts that didn't receive due attention, and yet they were ignored. Why? Human error? Overconfidence? Or something even more complex? Because what happened that morning wasn't just a military attack. It was the result of decisions, failures, and strategies that had been accumulating for a long time. And the most impressive thing, that was just the beginning. In the next few moments, you'll understand how this attack was planned behind the scenes, and why it was considered impossible, until it happened. And when you realize the level of precision involved, you'll understand that nothing there was by chance. Months before that dawn, everything was already in motion. Far away, on the other side of the ocean, Japanese military leaders were discussing an idea that to many seemed absurd: to attack the United States directly. More than that, to attack first. At the time, the US was considered practically untouchable, an industrial powerhouse with almost unlimited resources. Confronting them head-on seemed like suicide. But there was one man who thought differently: Isoroku Yamamoto. He knew the United States. He knew the power they were about to unleash, and precisely for that reason, he believed there was only one chance: a swift attack, devastating, surgical, a blow so strong it would prevent any immediate reaction. But there was a problem: how to surprise an entire nation. On the other side of the planet, the answer lay in something that until then was considered too risky: a mass airstrike from aircraft carriers. At dawn, never before executed in this way. It was a daring plan, complex and full of variables. Any mistake, and all would be lost. Still, they went ahead, and then began a silent preparation, almost invisible. Pilots were trained exhaustively, routes were tested, simulations were run repeatedly. Every second of the attack was calculated, every movement rehearsed. Nothing could get out of control. But there's one detail that makes it all the more impressive. The route to the target. To avoid detection, The Japanese fleet crossed the Pacific Ocean via a little-used route, cold, isolated, far from major trade routes. It was like disappearing into thin air, no open communication, no margin for error. For days, they advanced in complete silence. Now think about this for a second. If they were discovered ahead of time, the element of surprise would disappear and the whole plan would crumble. But they weren't, and that changes everything. In the early morning of the attack, the aircraft carriers were already in position. Just a few hundred kilometers from the target, the moment had arrived. And then, one by one, the planes began to take off, engines running in the dark, no lights, no fanfare, only the growing sound of the propellers cutting through the air. It was the beginning of the execution, but here is the most critical point of all. They weren't just going to attack. They were going to try to redefine the balance of the war, and perhaps buy enough time for Japan to consolidate its dominance in the Pacific. But there was one variable that no one could control: the American reaction. Because despite all the precision, despite all the planning, once started, there was no turning back, and what would happen in the next few hours would determine the fate of thousands of lives and the course of the war. But what few people know is that even with everything planned, something unexpected almost ruined everything. And if that had happened, the story we know today could be completely different. The clock was approaching 8 a.m. The sky was beginning to lighten. And then they appeared, first as small dots on the horizon, almost imperceptible, but in a matter of seconds, the sound betrayed everything. Engines loud, aggressive, relentless. This time there was no doubt it was an attack. The first planes dove rapidly, and then all hell broke loose. Bombs fell with brutal precision, explosions. In sequence, the ground trembled as if being torn apart from the inside out. Ships were hit before they could even react. Entire crews were caught by surprise. Some were still sleeping, others ran, not knowing where to go. Everything turned to fire. In seconds, this was no longer a military base. It was a field of destruction, the main target. The American fleet anchored in the port, and among those targets was the gigantic USS Arizona, a symbol of power, imposing but completely vulnerable at that moment. A bomb struck the ship with devastating force, and then a colossal explosion. A fireball rose into the sky. The impact was so violent that it practically split the ship in two. In seconds, it began to sink, taking hundreds of men with it, and that was just the beginning. Meanwhile, other planes attacked runways. The strategy was clear: prevent any air reaction, destroy the planes while still on the ground, and it worked. Entire rows of aircraft were destroyed before they even took off, defenseless. No time, no chance. The attack was not random. It was coordinated, synchronized. Each squad knew exactly what to do. Each target was already marked. It was like watching a perfectly executed plan in real time. But in the midst of the chaos, something began to change. Some soldiers managed to react. Machine guns were activated. Shots began to rise towards the sky, disorganized at first, but increasingly intense. And then, for the first time, the attackers began to encounter resistance. It wasn't enough to stop the attack, but it was the beginning of something important, because that moment marked the transition between surprise and reaction. And even with all the destruction, not everything went as planned. Some important targets were not hit, and that would have enormous consequences. But at that moment, nobody thought about that. All that existed was chaos, fire, and survival. Men trying to save other men. Bodies being pulled from the water. Explosions echoing endlessly. And the overwhelming feeling that this would never be forgotten. But what comes next is even more impactful, because the true effect of this attack wasn't just the destruction of that day, it was what it caused afterward. And when the response came, it changed the course of the war forever. The attack ended as quickly as it began, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Smoke still rose, Fire still consumed what remained, and the sound was no longer of explosions. It was of screams, cries for help, and silence. Among them, the scene was unrecognizable. Destroyed ships, water covered in burning oil, debris scattered everywhere, and thousands of lives forever marked. The attack on Pearl Harbor was over, but its consequences were only beginning. Within hours, the news spread. Shock, outrage, and one question dominated everything. How did this happen? The next day, then President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a speech that would go down in history. He called that moment a date that will live in infamy. And in that instant, everything changed. The United States, which until then had been outside the direct conflict, officially entered the war. And not only that, they entered with full force what was once a distant conflict. Now it was personal. The attack that should have weakened the US ended up causing exactly the opposite. It united the country, it mobilized its industry, and awakened a power that would change the course of World War II. But there's a crucial detail that few realize. Despite the massive destruction, not all strategic targets were hit. American aircraft carriers, considered essential, were not in port at that moment. And that changed everything, because those same ships would be fundamental in the confrontations that would follow. In other words, the attack was devastating, but it wasn't decisive, and perhaps that was the biggest mistake. Because instead of eliminating the United States' capacity to react, it accelerated an inevitable response, and an overwhelming one. In the following months, the Pacific would become the stage for intense battles, each movement charged with tension, each confrontation an attempt to turn the tide. But from that moment on, the balance had already begun to tip, and it all began there, at that dawn, with that attack, with that strategic error. Now stop for a second and think, what if that attack had never happened? What if it had been detected earlier, or worse? What if it had been completely successful? The story we know today would be completely different, because some events don't just mark time, they redefine the future. And what happened that day was exactly that, a point of no return. Quick summary: a surprise attack meticulously planned that caused massive destruction, but which, in the end, provoked an even greater reaction and changed the course of the war.